know that there's a lot of people in the room that remember my mom and dad from years ago, but there's also a lot of people in the room that really don't know the story about Bursch Travel and how it got started. So let me just tell you a little bit. My father was born in Woodlake, a little town down by Granite Falls. Is that in your county, Bill? Is that in your county? Okay. So he used to tell people, you know, Alexandria has changed a lot since I first moved here in 1913. He moved to Alexandria in 1913. He was 6 months old. His father was the manager of a grain elevator. And unfortunately, my grandfather was killed in a train accident. His car was hit by a train when my father was 10 years old. And he grew up in, he was the youngest of 7 kids, and he grew up during the Depression. Graduated from high school in 1931. And you can imagine there really wasn't Social Security, there wasn't the social net that there is today, and he grew up extremely poor. And yet, as a senior in high school, he was voted best dressed in his class. He had one pair of pants, and he would take it every night. He would take and make sure there were no spots on his pants, and he would press them, make sure that he looked fresh the next day. And there were all those people in the community that made sure that he had money. You know, he maybe got a job at a grocery store delivering groceries, or his brothers worked as fishing guides. He said, you know, my brothers kept me out of jail. I said, what do you mean about that? He said, well, my brothers were bootleggers. They wouldn't let me get involved because they didn't want me to get into trouble and be in jail. And so my father graduated from high school, and he left home with a dime in his pocket. It was 1931. He was 18 years old, and he hitchhiked to New Orleans looking for work. 1931, there weren't a lot of jobs around. And he would get to a town, he would go to the police department, and he'd say, do you have an empty bed in the cells where I can sleep tonight? And he worked his way to New Orleans, didn't find any work, worked his way back to Minnesota, eventually got involved with the CCC program, and that provided him with some money that he could send home. I said, why did you leave home if you only had a dime? And he said, because my mother had less, and if I stayed at home, she had to feed me. But he said I needed to provide something for her. So he got into the CCC program. After doing that for a year, he ended up getting hired by Montgomery Ward's in a department store in Brainerd. He moved from Brainerd to East Grand Forks to Fergus Falls, where he ended up meeting my mother, and then out to Watertown, South Dakota, and ended up being drafted, served in World War II, and then came back to Watertown, South Dakota. It was while he was in Watertown, he learned about a little bar and restaurant in a tiny little town 10 miles out of town that was for sale. He said it was for sale because the owner couldn't handle the business. It was so busy. So he went out to check out this bar and restaurant on a Friday night, and the place was so busy they couldn't get in the front door. The door wouldn't open. There were so many people inside. He worked there for a couple of years, but my mother wouldn't marry him if he was going to live in this little town. So he ended up moving to Sioux Falls, where he became the sales manager of an appliance firm, a wholesale appliance firm. He traveled all over the Midwest, selling to dealers in small towns. And he said, you know, the best thing that ever happened to me was being born poor, because it taught me how to hustle. So he was a salesman at heart, and in the early 50s, he had some problems with his back, injury that he had happened while he was in the Army, and so he had to have back surgery at the Mayo Clinic, and he was out of work for a year. About the same time in Alexandria, he had two sisters that were older than he was. One was recently widowed, and one was recently divorced, and neither had jobs. And so he said, I have to do something for my family. So he moved back to Alexandria, bought a little restaurant that was the Greyhound Bus Depot. And that was the start of the travel business. It was selling bus tickets to people. And as he would have people come in, occasionally somebody would say, well, I don't want to take the bus to Chicago, I want to fly to Chicago. And he said, well, I know how to make airline reservations because I had done it when I was in my business travel. So he was making airline reservations for people just out of the goodness of his heart. And somebody said to him, you know, if you were a travel agent and appointed by the airlines, you could get paid for this. And so he started investigating how you go about doing that. And they applied to the Airline Reporting Corporation, and a long application that you had to send in. One of the things that the airlines said was, is there a need in the community for a travel agency? Well, there weren't any other travel agencies in Alexandria, so there must not be a need. And so he got turned down 4 different times. So finally, after 4 tries, he got an appointment from the airlines, and then the airline reporting agreement said you had to have somebody with 2 years of experience working for you. Well, who do you find in Alexandria that has 2 years of experience when there's never been another travel agency in Alexandria? So for the first 2 years they were in business, they did everything without receiving a nickel of commission. All of the commissions were held in escrow. And so after several years, you know, they were able to continue staying in business. And my father was befriended by a guy that ran the American Express office in Minneapolis. He was a German war refugee that knew Europe like the back of his hand, and if somebody wanted to go to Europe, my father would take notes. He would take the train to Minneapolis a couple times a month. He'd sit down with John Strauss. They'd map out an itinerary. He'd come back to Alexandria to meet with the customers and talk like he was an expert. And, you know, after a few years of doing that, finally the travel agency became a better business than the restaurant. And he and my mother decided, you know what, we're going to concentrate on the travel business. And in the early 60s, they ended up closing up the restaurant. At that point, they had an office in Alexandria and in St. Cloud. But that's kind of the birth of our little company. And, I mean, you wouldn't think how hard it was when they started the business, but I remember my father's first desk was a door that he bought at the lumberyard. You know, and it was a sliding door. They took the hinges off of it, he laid it across 2 file cabinets. And that was his office. And he had a little typewriter that he could hunt and pack tight, type up itineraries. And he had the official airline guide, and he would always notch it to make sure he had the city. Some of these girls remember how to notch an airline guide. That was the first thing he taught anybody who started in the business. You gotta be able to turn it to Chicago right away, right? So, anyway, just a lot of great stories, and seeing the picture of my mom and dad really up in heaven last night. Yes.